Well, my connection isn't personal. It's through my grandpa, who I lived with, who was a political activist on the North Side and the Socialist Progressive Party area. So he was pretty far to the left.
What was your grandfather's name?
Isaac Berg.
Bob?
Starts with my father, Reuben Latz, who was involved in the Farmer Labor Party back in the Floyd Olson days, and then I gravitated into politics following him, starting at about 4 years old.
And your son, Ron Latz, my friend, has also followed your footsteps into politics.
My introduction to politics came through my father, who was Sam Hunnigs and a friend of Bob's father, Reuben. And he too was a young, active member of the Farmer Labor Party. These young people were, for the most part, either second generation, who were born here after their parents came from, for the most part, Eastern Europe. But some, of course, were direct immigrants who had become citizens and were active in the party. And Larry might think that his grandfather was somehow radical, and the fact of the matter is all of these people were radical in their ideas of the time, believing in things like health care and Social Security and job unemployment security and things of that sort.
Because Jews not only were restricted where they wanted to live, they had restrictive covenants up until the time the Supreme Court overruled them in 1948, but part of the reasons why we had such a lively, solid Jewish community in North Minneapolis was the fact that we were locked in geographically, and Golden Valley would not permit Jews, Edina would not, St. Louis Park, I don't think even in those days had many in the Jewish population. The first black person to live in Golden Valley was Carl Rowan, as a result of a lawsuit by Jonah Schwartz, who was a prominent Jewish civil rights lawyer. Things have changed drastically, but it was in fact one of the worst in social and economic and political ideas back in the mid-40s and before.
Many of the Jewish people who lived in Minneapolis had experienced the serious, even pogroms of Eastern Europe. They were looked at the United States as a place of great opportunity, but they had their own notions of what the obligations of the government should be and what opportunities people ought to have. And so these socialist feelings, while we can look at them as common kinds of things today, were quite uncommon in those times. But here in Minneapolis, we saw serious confrontations between the extremes of the far right and the extremes of the far left.
Larry, you said your father was active in the socialist movement.
Grandfather.
Excuse me, your grandfather. Did you have meetings at your house? What was the atmosphere like?
Well, there were what I remember, because I was young, are two things. He and most of his political friends met regularly. He was also very active in the union, labor union movement. He was a presser, steam presser at Gross Brothers Chronics, the dry cleaning place, and he literally worked in a sweatshop. So he was active in the labor unions. Most of his friends, as he, had come over from Russia and stuck together with the socialist movement in Russia. Not the communist movement. He didn't like it when he was called a communist, but he was a socialist. My memory, again from my grandfather, of his great hope for Hubert Humphrey was to get rid of the gangsters. And interestingly, in Minneapolis in the late 40s, I'm sure before then, starting in St. Paul in the 30s, moving to Minneapolis in the 40s, most of the gangsters, or the criminal element of organized crime, were Jews. You had Kid Can, you had Tommy Bank.
Tommy Banks was not Jewish.
Well, he wasn't. Okay,
No,
but there
no,
was
he was
another.
Irish. He was
Okay,
Irish.
but who was the other?
No, it was Kid Can, Larry, and Tommy Banks, and they divided the liquor business between the combination and the syndicate.
Okay.
And those were the two groups, but it wasn't all Jewish. That doesn't mean to defend what
No,
went
but
on.
there were
it was-
plenty of Jews in the element, and my memory is of my grandfather hating the gangsters and praising Humphrey and supporting someone who wasn't a progressive party or a socialist party politically. He was a big Humphrey supporter for mayor.
Because my father, who was very active in the labor movement and was one of those who first brought Hubert into back in the early 40s when Hubert first ran for mayor, my father served as sort of a bridge between the labor movement, which in part was very anti-communistic, with the building trades and the electrical workers and others who were on the communist fringe. And my father helped Hubert, Art Naftalin, and others who formed the DFL to bridge the gap between the labor movement and to isolate the communist elements in the labor movement to form the DFL party at the time of the merger. Well, Henry Bank was a longtime member of the Minneapolis City Council from the old 3rd Ward and eventually the 5th Ward. And Henry Bank was a very controversial character. He was intensely disliked by many people in the political venue because there were a lot of allegations about corrupt politics. I remember personally when I was about 4 or 5 years old passing out handbills for his opponent on the outside of Strimling's drugstore on Plymouth and Morgan when Henry Bank came up to me and offered me twice as much as I was getting for passing out the handbills if I would dump them down the sewer. And I turned him down. I've been holding out for a better price ever since. But that was my first experience with him. I never liked Henry Bank, and as I got older and was the chair of the DFL club in that area, when he came into conflict with Jerry Egan, Bank tried every device to get reelected, including packing the meetings, but we defeated him, and we ended up electing when the city council was reduced from 26 to 13 members, Bank got voted out of office.
But Henry always got the Jewish vote. In the North Side, for years and years and years, he was a lock to get elected to the city council.
Did he take care of the Jewish interests on the city council?
He catered to them, and I think he took care of the interests of those who took care of Henry.
Well, I think I was the first Jewish legislator after Sam Bellman. There was a 20-some year gap between Sam's service in the legislature and my election. I think what was interesting, and based upon what Larry said earlier, I used to get 8 to 9 to 1 margins out of the Jewish precincts, and Nellie Stone Johnson, who is an African-American Indian woman, used to take me by the hand, and I used to get 7, 8 to 1 margins out of the black precincts, and of course that made up, because the district went from Glenwood all the way up to 53rd Avenue North, and my margins in the elections in the 8 years I served decreased as we went further north into the non-Jewish areas. But it was a very fruitful experience, and my wife was the first president of the Rotunda Club, the wives of the state legislators, and I was the DFL endorsed candidate for Attorney General, and I think I was perhaps the first statewide endorsed candidate by a major party for statewide office that was Jewish in 1966, and I ran with Sandy Keith,
Right.
and we went down in flames, and I retired to private law practice until 1975 when I got elected to the Board of Regents in the aftermath of the regents turning down a qualified Jewish candidate for president of the university, a fellow by the name of Saxon, who was the chancellor of the University of California. And as it turned out, the one person who asked the unfortunate questions about his religious affiliation, was one of my strongest supporters in northwestern Minnesota when I ran for Attorney General, a fellow by the name L.J. Lee.
My mother was a homemaker, but devoted a lot of time to the pioneer women. It was a branch of the Verband, or the Labor Zionists. I believe there's a branch of it in St. Paul right now, and it has a different name.
Yeah.
Namat.
Namat.
And these were, some women were working women, some were homemakers, and they would get together, they would collect funds, particularly to promote the labor Zionist movement in Israel. But they also began the rummage sale movement and used clothing for Israel. And they also participated in the Jewish National Fund drives and some of the general Zionist drives as well.
Don't you know that's how Israel was built, by one brick at a time?
One chicken at a time.
No, at the picnics, who will pay $1 for a brick? And that's how Israel was built. They had cultural activities. I know that my father quite often would read some of the classic Yiddish stories, and other members of the group would do readings. Penny Siegel was one who did the readings, but lots of meetings, and then I remember the banquets that my mother dressing on a hot summer night, sweating and getting dressed up for the banquets.
Where were the banquets?
Usually at the little house they had on 10th and
1010 Knox.
1010 Knox.
Yeah, that was the famous address.
Right.
And that's where the Habonim met,
Right.
1010 Knox too. But the social events that I remember were gatherings in our living room to hear stories from somebody who had just come back from
Right,
Palestine.
right,
And
right.
there was such excitement, anticipation of hearing somebody
Well, the
first.
oranges that were harvested were counted by the ones.
Mhm.
Remember, so many oranges were harvested the previous year. But they weren't by the gross, they were by the ones.
Habonim means the builder. Bonim is build. Habonim is the builders. And we tried to recruit people to go to Habonim camp in Wisconsin. And that camp was called Yad Ari. And it was near Waupaca, Wisconsin, wasn't it? Or,
Yes, and there was also, the one I went to was in Winnipeg.
I went to
And
one
I
of
think
those,
that
too.
was called Camp
Hanika?
Utsa.
Was it?
You're right, I
My
forgot that.
brother went.
And there was also a leadership training camp near Detroit, around Three Rivers, Michigan, I think.
Oh, we would have seminars from the Twin City area. People from St. Paul would come over. We'd often meet at 1010 Knox, which was the, what did you call it? The National Institute?
No, the Jewish National Institute.
The Jewish
Is that
National
what it was
Institute.
called? I don't remember.
That building was the sort of the center of all the labor Zionists in this area. The Verband, the Polition, Habonim, and there was a Howard Gordon. Remember him?
yeah.
Sure.
He was sort of the shamus, you might say, of the building. He always took care of the building.
But I have this one story to tell about Golda Meir at a General Assembly some years ago when 3,000 representatives of Jewish communities of North America stood up and gave her a standing ovation. She loved it, but she said she contrasted that to the first time she came back to the States to raise money for the War of Independence. And she landed in New York, nobody met her, she didn't know where to go. Somebody said, go to Minneapolis. There's a group there that will help you, and indeed that happened. And she told this publicly to this National Assembly. So for some reason, and I don't know the reason, that there was this committed, passionate group in the Twin Cities.
She had lunch at our house.
Did she?
And the meal was rather simple, and she ate very sparingly, and her dress was tailored and simple, and she was very straight from the shoulder in her talk to people, and she told them exactly what she thought.
Miriam Rappaport was a close friend of mine, and Miriam's home was very sparsely furnished because the family knew that they were going to make aliyah. It was just a matter of when, and they were really kind of just camping out, marking time until the time would come that they could make that move. And they did indeed all make aliyah.
Part of me thought I was preparing for life in Palestine. All the stories, the feeling, and yet at the same time, on a parallel track, I was going to the University of Minnesota and being integrated in the general society. And I think my parents were sort of conflicted. They never did it, but most of their friends did make aliyah.
My parents, for all their idealism, had some conflict about my being part of Habonim because it was sort of anti-mainstream. And on the one hand, they liked the idealism of it. On the other hand, they were drawn to the good life in America. So they weren't sure that I was doing the right thing by being so active in Habonim.